Even the mainstream media is talking about how we may see another global financial crisis this year.
It's going to be at least as bad as 0809. People don't want to say that.
But I think they're completely wrong. I don't think we'll have another GFC because this time in 2023, unfortunately, I think it may be even worse. I'm going to explain why in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go right over the most powerful economic indicator. And this is per the Federal Reserve. In fact, editor, let's go right to the internet and hear straight from Jerome Powell himself.
So this article goes back to March 21st of 2022. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell on Monday weighed in on a major topic of debate in the bond market. The question, where to look to determine the chances for a U.S. recession. It says some investors have been calling attention to a rapidly shrinking spread between 2-year and 10-year Treasury yields, sounding the alarm, something we've been doing on this channel for the last year. Talk about that inversion. But Powell says, frankly, there's good research by staff in the Federal Reserve System that really says to look at the first 18 months of the yield curve. That's really what has 100% of the explanatory power of the yield curve. It makes sense because if it's inverted, that means the Fed is going to cut, which means the economy is weak. Those are Jerome Powell's words, not mine.
So what is this secret indicator the Fed uses that Jerome Powell himself says is so powerful? It would be the near-term forward spread. This is a chart of a 90-day moving average. We go all the way back to 2005. And in fact, the original chart, editor, go ahead and throw that up, goes back even further. And it goes all the way to today's date. On the left, we go from 0% up to 4%, all the way down to a negative 4%. So anything below 0 would indicate that this curve is inverted. All right, so what metrics are we measuring? Well, it's the expected 3-month Treasury yield looking 18 months out relative to the current 3-month Treasury yield. Let's assume for a moment that the market participants right now are betting that the 3-month Treasury yield is going to be 2% in 18 months. But today, as we speak, the 3-month Treasury yield, let's just say, is yielding 5%. All right, well, that's a 3% delta. What that would tell you is that this near-term forward spread was inverted by 3%, using those numbers as an example. So when we look at this chart, in fact, going all the way back even before 2005, we can see that Jerome Powell is right. This is very powerful in its ability to predict when we will have a recession and if we will have a recession. As an example, we've got this 90-day moving average right before the GFC. It inverted by about 1%. Then it went right back up, and then just prior to the cerveza sickness, it inverts again. The problem is today, as you would imagine, it's inverted, but it's inverted even more than it was prior to the GFC. So what that's telling us is market participants are betting their own money that the Fed is going to drop rates even faster than they did during the GFC and even faster than they did prior to the cerveza sickness. Now, if they're dropping rates that fast, they're not going to be doing that because we're having a soft landing. They're going to be doing that because we are in a financial or economic crisis. Another thing I'd like to point out, according to the Fed's own website, the near-term forward spread predicts monetary policy, recessions, in other words, negative GDP, and it predicts stock market crashes. And right now, the Fed's most powerful economic indicator is saying that things are worse today than they were in 2008, leading up to the global financial crisis. Step number 2, real Americans are struggling, and it's only getting worse. So in step number 1, we talked about these esoteric curves and yield curve inversions, near-term forward spreads. It's all this mumbo jumbo. But now let's talk about what it's like for the average Joe and Jane, the real-life impact of a deteriorating economy. We've got this index that goes all the way back to 2021 to May of 2022. So keep in mind, if we had a chart that went all the way to today's date, the numbers would be even worse. And what this is showing us is wages, nominal wages, indicated by this black line, compared to real wages. When you adjust for inflation, on the left, we go from 100 starting point up to 113, down to 97, about 95 or so. And if you just look at nominal wages over the last couple of years, things look pretty good. And this is what the mainstream media likes to focus on, including the central planners at the Federal Reserve. So we've got the average Joe right here, and he has got a big grin on his face because his paycheck has gone way up. But unfortunately, when the average Joe takes his paycheck to the grocery store, that's when he starts to get pissed. That's when Joe turns into Mad Joe. Because once he starts paying for food, shelter, energy, he realizes that his purchasing power has gone down even though his paycheck has gone up. In other words, he's far worse off today financially than he was in 2019. Now, I know a lot of you right now that are really paying attention are saying to yourself, wait a minute, George. I mean, I see these curves you're talking about, and it is true, real wages have gone down, but every single time I go to a restaurant or a movie theater or the bowling alley, it's just absolutely packed. It looks like the economy is booming. And that's a very good observation. I think this is key. But what we have to ask ourselves is who is actually doing the spending at the bowling alleys, the movie theaters, the restaurants. Mostly, it's younger people. Okay, well, let's think this through. A lot of the younger people today, and I'm not going to paint with a broad brush or anything. I'm not going to stereotype, but it is true. A lot of younger people today live at home. It's a lot different than when I was growing up, and your parents would literally kick you out of the house no matter what when you turned 18. So if you've got a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old that's still living at home, they really don't have all of these costs that the households have. Are they paying for food? Maybe. Shelter? No. Energy? No. Are they paying for a car? No. They can just go ahead and take Uber. So if their nominal wages have gone up, well, their real wages have likely gone up as well. And let's not forget, they haven't had to make any student loan payments since 2020. That's almost 3 years. So is it any surprise that the restaurants, the movie theaters, and the bowling alleys are packed? Absolutely not. But does that mean the economy is doing well? Absolutely not. Because the majority of the population actually has expenses that have gone up, and therefore their purchasing power has gone down dramatically. Now let's compare this to what happened in 2008. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of real wages back then. And we can see that during the GFC and prior to the GFC, although it wasn't a lot, real wages were going up. So let's think about that. Prior to the GFC, we had this buffer of real wages going up. We're now headed into the next crisis, as predicted by the Fed's own yield curve. Real wages are going down, not up. And in my opinion, this is one of the many reasons we could be headed into something that's even worse than what we saw in 2008. Oh, but wait, unfortunately, there is more. I looked at a chart the other day that completely blew my mind. And for those of you who watch my old videos, I'm going to give you a warning right now. It is officially stiff drink time. So make sure you're sitting down before you look at this chart because it is sobering, no pun intended, to say the least. Editor, let's cut right to the internet.
Let's start by going right to my Twitter feed and something I retweeted yesterday. This is from my good buddy Macro Alf. You can follow him at Macro Alf on Twitter. 44% of Americans expect to apply for a buy now, pay later loan at least once in the next 6 months. That's roughly 150 million Americans. He goes on to say, what do they need these buy now, pay later loans for? According to a recent LendingTree survey, 21% of respondents needed a buy now, pay later loan to buy groceries. Just let that sink in for a moment. And I'd also like to point out exactly what I said in this retweet, that 21% of respondents are borrowing money to buy groceries at, mind you, a 28% interest rate on these buy now, pay later loans. And this is occurring when the unemployment rate in the United States is 3.5%. What happens if we go through a recession and the unemployment rate goes up to 7, 8, maybe 10% or even higher? Just think how many Americans will have to borrow money to buy groceries then. It's going to be like nothing we've ever seen. It's going to make the Great Depression look like a picnic. Now let's go to the actual data in the chart. So of the people that responded, so again, 44% of Americans, that's 150 million people, 46% are taking out this buy now, pay later loan at 28%, mind you. That's the average I got from my research assistant, Josh, to buy clothing, shoes. 34%, home decor, appliances. Technology, 27%. Beauty, body, and hair care products, 26%. I mean, let that sink in a moment. You've got 150 million people, 26%, let's just say that's 35 million people, are borrowing money to buy shampoo. Meanwhile, all these 25-year-old kids are packing every single restaurant and bar that you drive by. It's this totally bifurcated economy. Then we get down to groceries, like we said, 21%. So that's 35 million Americans right now borrowing money at 28% just to put food on the table. And unfortunately, if the Fed's own powerful economic indicator is right, this is going to get far worse before it gets better. And I can assure you, going into the last GFC, the average Joe and Jane was not struggling to this degree.
Step number 3. Now let's go ahead and look at the banking system. We know the first GFC was a financial crisis, but what's happening today in 2023, maybe even before we get to a recession? Well, let's look at this chart that goes all the way back to 2007 to today's date. On the left, we go from 0 billion up to 600 billion. This is the inflation-adjusted size of the bank failures that we have seen in 2023 compared to what we saw in 2008. So in 2008, we had about 500 billion. Those are the assets on the balance sheet of the banks that failed. But what do we see now? And again, these are inflation-adjusted numbers. Today, and we're not even through 2023. In fact, we're only 4 or 5 months in to 2023, and the size of bank failures have exceeded what we saw during the global financial crisis in 2008. But then, of course, the argument that you're going to get from all your friend and family member Freds is, yeah, George, okay, but it was all with 3 or 4 banks and it's contained. It's no big deal. There's no systemic risk like we saw in 2008. So this is all just fear-mongering and tinfoil hat stuff. Okay, well, let's go ahead and think that through. So what does the housing market look like today compared to 2008? Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of housing prices compared to incomes, and we can see the housing bubble today is even worse than it was back then. Okay, how about the stock market? Editor, you know what to do. Go ahead and throw up the Buffett indicator, and we can see once again, today it's worse. And I probably don't even have to mention the problems that we are seeing right now with commercial real estate. The prices in nominal terms have already started to plummet. And I'd like to remind everyone that that is a $20 trillion commercial real estate bubble that is now starting to pop. And it has tremendous systemic risk with today's banking system. And we saw that play out just the other day when First Republic was the last bank to go bust. But what about the consumer? The unemployment rate is very low, 3.5%, like we discussed earlier. So isn't the consumer spending going to go ahead and give the economy the buffer it needs to avoid a recession, economic depression, or something that's even worse than what we saw in 2008? Well, first and foremost, like we said in step number 2, Moody the millennial, or I'll have to think of another character for the Gen Z, but the young people, let's say, with their blue hair, they do not equal the average Joe and Jane. And the average Joe and Jane is far more important to the overall health of the economy than Moody the millennial, regardless of how many pronouns they have. But like I highlighted in that tweet earlier, I would argue the fact that we have a 3.5% unemployment rate is actually a bad thing, not a good thing. Because think about what's happening right now, well, with the banking system, as an example. And we have had more banking collapses this year, or larger banking collapses in aggregate total than we did in 2008. And that's with an extremely low unemployment number. So what happens to the banking system when the unemployment rate goes up even higher? You say, well, George, well, how do you know that's going to happen? Let's go right back to the yield curve, the 2s and 10s, or the near-term forward spread. And what we can see is that when the curve is inverted, that's not usually when the stuff hits the fan. It's when the curve is no longer inverted. And what I mean by that is currently the curve is inverted. So whatever we're seeing throughout the economy right now is just the beginning. It's just the tip of the iceberg. Once that curve starts to uninvert, if that's a word, or once that curve is no longer inverted, that's when we're really going to see the full impact of that economic tsunami that is headed our direction. So if you have a lot of friend and family member Freds that are pointing at the unemployment rate and saying that it's impossible that we go into a recession. I mean, look at what Janet Yellen is saying. She's saying the labor market is extremely tight. This means the economy is on fire. Yada, 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 yada. I would like you to go ahead and give them this chart. Editor, go ahead and throw it up. And we can see that going back to the 1940s, for heaven's sakes, every single time we're at the beginning of a recession, the unemployment rate is very low, just like it is today in 2023. So my base case, the way this plays out, is once that yield curve, for either the near-term forward spread, the 2s and 10s, it doesn't matter. We'll focus on the 2s and 10s because that's super easy for everyone to follow. Once that 2-year Treasury yield goes back below the 10-year Treasury yield, likely within the next few months after that, you'll start to see the unemployment rate go up. And that's when the cracks in the economic dam get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's when we'll most likely see even more of these bank failures that will turn into a crisis that exceeds what we saw during the GFC and 2008. So the next question becomes, what can you do to protect yourself? How can you make sure that you survive and thrive this economic storm that is likely coming our way? Well, the first thing you can do is make sure you're educated, have an edge. And there's no better way to do that than go to Rebel Capitalist Live. This is the conference that I'm holding May 12th through the 14th in Orlando. We've got speakers like Peter Schiff, Mike Maloney, Lynn Alden, Brent Johnson, Jeff Snyder, just to name a few. You're going to be able to meet them face to face, rub elbows, ask them your questions directly, and even more importantly, you can meet, hang out, network with your fellow rebel capitalists and build that sense of community. And that's how to really be resilient and anti-fragile regardless of what happens in 2023 and into 2024. So you can get your tickets ASAP at rebelcapitalistlive.com. I look forward to seeing you in Orlando, May 12th through the 14th.